Hi, this is Maria Sanchez. We're broadcasting live from the Presidential Ronald Reagan Library. We're here because the 66th Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, is signing books, and then she's going to be having a speech in just a little bit, which we will simulcast on kadytv.com. But we wanted to chat with you. What is your name, please?
Marianne Pennington.
And Marianne, where do you live?
We just flew in today from Philadelphia.
Oh my goodness. Did you fly in just for this?
Well, actually, we flew in to come to the Reagan Library. I didn't know Condoleezza Rice was going to be here, and so we we walked into it and we bought a book, and we've been waiting for 4 hours to have her sign.
Oh my goodness. Talk about luck or happenstance or kismet or whatever.
Absolutely.
Now, I see that you're overcome with emotion. Can you explain what's going on?
I've followed Lisa for a long time, and she's been an inspiration to me, knowing her life story and how she's come to be where she is and who she is. And I was overcome with emotion as soon as I saw her. And as usual, I couldn't even talk to her. I couldn't say a thing. But I'm glad I got to meet her. She's a lovely woman, and she's really accomplished a lot in her life, considering her background.
Not even considering, but almost in spite of her background.
Exactly.
She's accomplished so much. And you're telling me you flew in from Philadelphia.
That's correct.
To come to Southern California,
That's
and your
correct.
first visit is to the Reagan Library,
Yes.
and you happen to luck out that it's
Yes.
with Condoleezza Rice.
We've been up since 3:30 in the morning, Philadelphia time. I'm about ready for, and I haven't eaten all day, I'm about ready for
A cocktail.
a shower and a nice glass of wine, and maybe a little chat at the bar about what just happened to me.
How exciting.
I am very excited. I'm thrilled.
I'm so glad that I happened to see you.
Thank you
And
very
thank you
much.
for joining us. I will give you our card. You will be able to send the information to your family and friends. We are simulcasting her speech tonight. So if you don't have a ticket to the
No, we
speech,
do. We do
you
not.
can log onto our website and watch it, and you can share this part of the interview with your friends and family too.
Thank you very much. Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much.
So say hi. Who do you go on to say hi to?
My daughter and my grandchildren, I love you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Maria Sanchez reporting live from the Presidential Ronald Reagan Library. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maria Sanchez continuing our coverage with kadytv.com at the Reagan Library. 66th Secretary of State. You try and say that fast. 66th Secretary of State. Condoleezza Rice is here. She's signing books, and then she's going to be speaking. Not only are we going to be simulcasting that, but you can watch that if you happen to come in during it, or if you want to go into our archives and see it at a later date. Please feel free to send it around. Obviously, the more news, the better. You'll see behind me is the line, which is where Condoleezza Rice is inside the library, the bookstore, if you will, and they're funneling the people through. And then we're just going to take a little walk down the line so you can see the woman that we interviewed from Philadelphia. She was in line for 4 hours, so that's probably one of the longest waits. And the man that we interviewed first, he had come and gone. So you can see it's all walks of life, all ages, and obviously all passionate about meeting and having her signature on their book, which I don't know if I'm going to be able to snag one myself because I bought a book. So we'll see. And if we want to walk a little bit further, we can walk to see just how far the line goes. She's obviously only going to be able to sign until, let's keep going, until her speech, which is at 6 o'clock. So I don't know if they cut off the line in order to accommodate the people, so that somebody isn't standing in line needlessly. But I'm not going to tell them how to do their business because they've done this before. So we'll keep going. Oh, it looks, this may be the end here. So let's just go down and make sure you get everybody's face so they know. They can see themselves. Hello, Martha. Let's talk. Will you speak with us?
Sure.
Okay. This is Martha and House. I was going to say, I was thinking White House.
Well, we're close.
Yeah. Martha House is very involved with the Republican Party. What are your titles?
Well, I am a past president of the California Federation of Republican Women. I am a past regional vice chair of the California Republican Party. I have been elected to the Mount San Antonio Community College Board of Trustees, and I have made many kings working in grassroots politics. And now
perhaps
I'm
a
creating queen now.
And we're speaking of Meg Whitman, of
That's
course.
right. That's right.
What's your capacity with the Meg campaign?
I'm the Los Angeles County Regional Director for the Mega Women Coalition for Meg Whitman.
And that will be decided 2 weeks from today.
That's exactly right. And November 3rd, we will have a historic moment where we will elect the first female Republican governor of California.
2 firsts, huh?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, Martha, you are here to see Condoleezza Rice?
I am.
And do you attend the speakers series often?
You know what? Not too often. But I worked the dedication of this library when it opened.
Did you really?
I did. It was such an honor. I even worked the dedication of the Nixon Library. So I've been around a long time.
And yet you don't look it.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
She has
I
the
tell everybody,
secret.
politics keeps you young because it keeps you moving.
Yeah, that's for sure.
That's right.
So are you here to get a book signed too?
Yes.
Are you in line?
Well, my husband is. I'm just
Okay.
trying to find a lady. That, and then I'll be back in line again.
Okay. All right. Well, Martha House is active in the party, and whatever persuasion you believe in, you should take an example from Martha, because your opinion counts, and your actions and your time count.
Thank you very much, Maria.
You're welcome, Martha.
Okay.
All right, take care.
All right. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
You're welcome.
And I'm going to give you, and we're still on camera, but that's okay. We're going to go down. You can log on and you can see this later.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. So we'll just keep on going. Who knows who else we're going to run into? After all, this is in our backyard. Wow. And the line's moving pretty quickly, so that's a good thing. So just giving you a panoramic view of as we go on down the line. Not a lot of Reagan Reds, I'm noticing. Just a few of us in terms of wardrobe. Let us speak. Hello. Oh, I'm going to come talk with you. But let's chat first with the former mayor of Thousand Oaks and his wife. This is Tom and Karen Glancy.
Maria, always
Welcome.
nice to see you.
And thank you for joining us on KADYTV.com. And get over here. We'll move with her so that the line doesn't...
She is so spoiled, I swear.
So Tom Glancy is on the Thousand Oaks City Council, and you were mayor last year, right?
Exactly.
And how long have you been on the council?
I've been on the council 4 years and Planning Commission 7 before that.
But by trade you are a?
Dentist.
So, because city council members have day jobs.
Yes, we
It's
do.
not just a hobby.
We're not relying on the council salary.
Let's just keep moving so we don't hold the line up. I'm amazed at how efficient this operation is.
Oh, I am too.
It's, I mean, because the end of the line is right there. They must know to cut it off, is my
But
guess.
you know, the subject is such a neat person. Who wouldn't stand in line forever for her?
Well, we just chatted with a gal that was 4 hours in line. She was one of the first. She flew in from Philadelphia, came to the library, didn't know that Condoleezza Rice was here, started crying as soon as she saw
Wow.
her. So, yeah, talk about a
That's
wonderful
neat.
visit to Southern California.
Absolutely.
So anything you want to share with our viewers about the beautiful city of Thousand Oaks?
Thousand Oaks is a gorgeous place to be and live. And thank you so much for what you do for the whole community.
You're welcome. It's
Yeah.
our pleasure. All right, Tom and Karen Glancy. And we're just going on down the line. All right. So I'm not being prejudicial. Whoever I know that I can chat with is who we're chatting with, and then we'll just pick random strangers also like we did with the first couple. And just wanted to give you an idea of who's here and the line. And everyone's got a book in hand, obviously, because this is a book signing. So it goes down, and it does loop around, and then this is the end. So we made it. So nice. Did they cut you off? Do you know? In terms, because she's only signing for X amount of time, so I didn't know. No? Okay. Do you mind chatting with us? No. Okay. Yes. Who are you? Eric, hi. Maria Sanchez. And Eric, where are you from?
I live in Westlake Village.
Okay. And are you a frequent visitor to the
I've been
library?
here 3 or 4 times, but I came specifically to see Secretary Rice speak.
And so you're not only having her sign your book, but you're going to watch the talk.
Absolutely, yeah. I want to see what she has to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And why Condoleezza Rice? What was it compelling about her for you?
Well, I admire her as a person and her story and everything she went through, and she's one of the few people I would stand in this line to have sign a book, so I think she's a very special person and a great role model.
And it looks like you are last in line. In fact, let's keep going. So you're sweet to stand there. I don't want you to lose your last place. So thank you for chatting with us, and I'm going to give you the card. You'll be able to watch this later on the net. We're also, we're simulcasting her talk also.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. So there you have it. We are broadcasting live from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library for Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's book signing as well as her talk. And we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. And keep in mind that as soon as we're done with the pre-feed, we are going to be simulcasting her speaking live. So stay tuned and don't you go.
For those of you I have not yet had the chance to meet, my name is John Hybush. I am the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. Once Mrs. Reagan and her special guest arrive at their seats, I'd like to ask all of you to please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to welcome former First Lady Nancy Reagan, escorted by her special guest, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Now, in honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedom around the world, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize some special guests that we have with us here this evening. And I'd like to begin with President Reagan's ambassador to the Court of St. James, Charles Price, and his wife, Carol. Ambassador, great to have you here. Our absolutely terrific Congressman, Elton Gougley, and his wife, Janice. Congressman. Our Ventura County Sheriff, Bob Brooks, who is retiring after many years of helping this library. Bob. Our Thousand Oaks City Council members, Tom Glancy and Jackie Irwin, and Moore Park City Councilman Mark Van Dam. This one I love, the 1960 Olympic decathlon gold medalist Rafer Johnson and his wife Betty. And finally, Duke Blackwood, our library director, who I think has with him tonight his father, Jack. Duke, where are you at? There you are. Finally, on behalf of our Board of Trustees and the supporters of the Reagan Foundation, I want to thank General Electric for its outstanding support of our mission. GE is the presenting sponsor of the Reagan Centennial in 2011, and without them, great events like this would just not be possible. So please, a round of applause for them. For tonight's introduction of our special guest, I would like to turn to the dictionary and provide you with a definition of 3 words that I find most appropriate in presenting to you Secretary Rice. As an aside, I should begin by noting that as I was preparing this introduction, my wife told me the first word for anyone introducing someone with the stature of Secretary Rice ought to be nervous. While she is absolutely correct, I will set aside what Webster says is acute uneasiness or apprehension and persevere. No, the first word is actually honored. Webster defines honor as to regard or to treat with respect. And simply glancing at Secretary Rice's many achievements over the years, how could respect not come to mind? She has twice been ranked by Forbes as the most powerful woman in the world, and Time magazine has listed her as one of the world's most influential people 4 times. So we are indeed honored. The second word from the dictionary that comes to mind in introducing the Secretary is extraordinary. Extraordinary, among other qualities, is defined as exceptional to a very marked degree. Most certainly, there is a fit here as well. She comes to us today as an author, a political science professor at Stanford University, and a senior public policy fellow at the Hoover Institute. While at Stanford, she has been awarded 2 of their highest teaching honors. Secretary Rice, our nation's 66th Secretary of State, was the first African-American woman to serve in that position, as well as the second woman in history to serve in that role. She was the first woman to serve in the role of National Security Advisor to the President. Of particular note to us, during the Reagan administration, she served as a special assistant to the director of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and as an arms control and foreign policy specialist. And fortunately for us, just like President Reagan, and actually during the first term of President Reagan, she switched her party registration from Democrat to Republican. This was due in great part to her respect for his moral vision for America and the world. Finally, the third word appropriate for our lexicon this evening is thankful. To be thankful, according to the dictionary, is to be well pleased. And we are also well pleased you are with us tonight, Madam Secretary. While you are here, we hope that you will have a chance to see some of the things that Mrs. Reagan and our Board of Trustees have preserved in honor of the President's memory. One object in particular is appropriate to mention this evening, and we are all particularly thankful to have it as well. Just outside of Mrs. Reagan's door in the Foundation offices is this extraordinary grand piano. It was donated by master pianist and songwriter Roger Williams, who performed for President and Mrs. Reagan at the White House. It was his favorite piano, one on which he wrote and played many of his million-selling hits. I raise the topic of pianos for good reason. Some of you may know that while Secretary Rice is not a professional pianist, the New York Times has pronounced her the world's most prominent amateur musician. And this was before her most recent concert this summer accompanying Aretha Franklin. Secretary Rice, we are thankful you have joined us and well pleased that as talented as you may be in music, you decided to pursue a path that has made you the very definition of what it means to be one of the finest public servants in our nation. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a conversation with Secretary Condoleezza Rice. it is oftentimes the case when we have distinguished visitors here that they might give a lengthy speech. It is very special to us when someone agrees, as the Secretary has, to sit for questions and answers. And what my plan is to spend a few minutes asking the Secretary questions about her book and her life, and then I'll turn it over to you in the audience, where we'd be happy to take questions from you towards the latter half of the visit. So with that, I get the first question. Secretary Rice, I think it's probably important to set the stage for our audience in that you have two books coming out. This is the first, The Extraordinary Ordinary People,
Yes.
and then next year another will be coming out. And having read this book, I found it fascinating. Most biographies are just kind of all about me, me, me. But this one was really a tribute to your parents and to those that have supported you throughout your life. Why did you feel it appropriate to write that at this point?
Well, indeed, when you're finishing 8 years and you're trying to think about and reflect on those 8 years, you have to decide what you're going to say at the end of it. And I had planned to write the obligatory Secretary of State's 8-year memoir, and in fact I will do that. But with each implausible event over that last year or so, whether it was negotiating with Israelis and Palestinians or standing in front of a plane that said the United States of America behind me, or going off to be the first Secretary of State to visit, of all people, Gaddafi in Libya, I decided that this was a kind of implausible story. And I myself kept asking the question that people asked me: how did you get to where you are? How did that little girl with the pigtails from Birmingham, Alabama, become Secretary of State? And I always say to people, you had to know John and Angelina Rice in order to answer that question. And so really, this is John and Angelina Rice, my parents. It's their story wrapped, my story wrapped inside of their story. And that's why I wanted to write the book, because nothing that I have done, no one that I've become, nothing that I've become would have been possible without my extraordinary, ordinary parents.
Well, you succeeded, because you certainly get that impression when you finish the first 4 or 5 chapters, absolutely. Now, you've written several books before, policy-oriented,
Yes.
Very much in the field of international relations. How was the task for you this time to write a book that was just very introspective and very personal? Was it a much more of a chore for you to do that?
Well, it was really a great joy, and in some ways a kind of literally labor of love to do it. I have always written books in which you start by doing the research and you mobilize evidence to support an argument. And I'm accustomed to working in depth with documents. Well, the first thing that I learned is that the Rices and the Rays were not great document keepers. I, with great ceremony, opened the family Bible to find that they'd entered almost nothing in it. So somehow our family didn't keep great records. And I had to then decide how I was going to deal with not just my own memories, this book is full of my own memories, but with a reconstruction of my parents' life and my grandparents' life before them. I didn't want to do a genealogy, but I did want people to know who my parents and grandparents were. And so I came upon the idea of actually spending time and interviewing people who had known them, people with whom they'd worked, people that they taught. There was one woman in particular, my mother's niece, a woman named Edith Williams, who is now 95 years old and has a memory like an iron trap. And so she gave me wonderful stories. But I loved writing it, and I found that the more that I wrote it, the more I enjoyed writing it and getting to know my parents in a whole different way.
That's terrific. Even someone as myself or many others in this room who might have been involved in politics for many years, for us, when they hear Condoleezza Rice and they think, well, back to the beginning, they perhaps as far back as we go as, well, she must have been born and raised at Stanford. Stanford was kind of to the beginning of your life, but when you read this book, it's, oh, that is so far from the truth. And what I found most remarkable is that your history is really one where you lived and experienced the moments of ground zero in terms of the civil rights movement, the desegregation movement, and all that was occurring in Birmingham, Alabama during the early 1960s. So could you just give us a glimpse of what life was like back then, because you were at the very epicenter of where civil rights was unfolding.
I was born in 1954, and so you don't have to count. That means I'm 55. I'll be 56 next month, so we've disposed of that.
I was not going to ask that.
Yeah, I know. It would have been impolite. But the reason the book is entitled Extraordinary Ordinary People is that my parents were in many ways ordinary people. My mom was a school teacher. She taught English and later on science. As a matter of fact, one of her first pupils, first students, was Willie Mays. She taught at Fairfield Industrial High, and Willie Mays told me when I interviewed him, he said, "Oh yes, I remember your mother very well." He said, "She told me, son, you're going to be a ball player. And if you need to leave class a little bit early, you go right ahead." So he remembered her fondly, Miss Ray, as he called her. But Mother was an elegant woman who loved music and loved the arts. In fact, believed in the democratization of the arts. So she, in the very poor high school in which she taught in Birmingham, she brought operettas and opera to that school. She did, however, never pick up a until her view was girls didn't do that, so she had to come to terms with my tomboy tendencies, but she was a very elegant woman. My father was also ordinary, Presbyterian minister, guidance counselor at the high school, later on a university administrator, a big man, a big imposing man who'd been a football player, whose great love was sports. And had I been born a boy, I was going to be named John. He had already bought John's football, and I was going to be an All-American linebacker. So he was a little bit unhappy, I guess, initially when he found out he had a girl. So that's who my parents were. They were ordinary people. I doubt that between them they ever made $60,000. But the extraordinary circumstance was that it was in Birmingham, Alabama, that they raised a little girl to believe that while she might not be able to have a hamburger at the Woolworth's lunch counter, which indeed you could not in Birmingham, she could be President of the United States if she wanted to be. And this little community of Titusville, which was a little black enclave, middle-class black enclave in Birmingham, all of the kids were raised to believe that. That despite the fact that this was the Birmingham of complete segregation. I did not have a white classmate until we moved to Denver when I was 12. You could not go into a restaurant. You could not go into a movie theater. It wasn't as if segregation imposed upon your life every day. Most of the time, we went to our ballet lessons and our piano lessons in school, and people got married and people enjoyed their lives. But occasionally, maybe not so occasionally, segregation would intrude. I tell the story of going to see Santa Claus when I was about 5 years old. And you know the drill. You go to the department store, you sit the kid on Santa's lap, and Santa asks what the kid wants for Christmas. This particular Santa Claus, however, was holding little black children out here and putting little white children on his knee. And my father, as I said, a big and imposing man, said, "Angelina, if he does that to Condoleezza, I'm going to pull all that stuff off of him and show what a cracker he really is." And so there I am, little 5-year-old Condi, thinking, who's going to go off here? Santa Claus Daddy, Santa Claus Daddy. But it was what Birmingham was like. And then in 1962, 1963, what had been the humiliations, in a sense, of segregation became a great violent period. Birmingham became known as Bombingham. Bombs went off in neighborhoods all the time. I can remember coming home one night from my grandparents' house, and there was a loud thud. And at that time, everybody knew that a bomb had gone off. And so my father turned the car around and started to drive. And my mother said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going to the police." And she said, "They probably set it off." This was Bull Connor, the days of Eugene Bull Connor, the horrible police commissioner. So it was in some ways a terrifying place, Birmingham, but it was also a place where, in this little enclave, all of those circumstances were simply set aside, and you were told you might not be able to control your circumstances, but you could certainly control how you responded to your circumstances. And if you were well educated, then you would be able to respond to your circumstances positively. And oh, by the way, there was no room for victims, and there was no room for excuses.
Yeah, I in fact, yeah. In fact, I wrote down one of the quotes from your book, which I thought was just terrific, that, where you say that your parents and those around them in your neighborhood had a message for all the kids, which it said, "We love you and we will give you everything we can to help you succeed, but there are no excuses and there is no place for victims."
Yes.
Which is really a remarkable statement in the face of what was going on at that time in Birmingham. I wondered, as you wrote that, if you think there's that kind of statement is appropriate for today's times as well. I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah, the problem with seeing yourself as a victim is that you constantly feel aggrieved by everything that is going on around you. And it's funny, the twin of aggrievement is entitlement. I'm entitled to that. You have to give that to me. I should have that. And what Birmingham instead taught its kids is that you'll have to work hard for that. In fact, they had a phrase, you'll have to be twice as good. And they didn't say it, by the way, as a matter for debate. They just sort of said it, and you internalized it. And I think it made us stronger. It made us strong in a place where we could have been beaten down. It made us have limitless horizons in a place where we could have thought nothing possible. And that same little community in Birmingham produced the man who is currently the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore, the man who is currently the president of the University of Missouri, Kansas City, the woman who was the first black woman governor of the IMF, and by the way, a Treasury official in the Reagan administration. It produced the man who is the head of the largest trauma center in the country in Los Angeles, a woman who is a professor of medieval studies at George Mason University, and 2 Pulitzer Prize winners. Yeah. That little 7 square blocks. And so my father once said he was going to write a book called Something in the Water. It must have been something in the water. But I think it was something in the values.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, let's shift gears just a little bit here. I would like you to tell the audience how you finagled your way into getting your very first piano.
Oh, yes. Well, my parents were great in allowing me to mature pretty early. So I started taking piano lessons when I was 3. My grandmother taught piano during the day. My mother and father would teach. I would go and bang at the piano. Finally, she decided to teach me. My grandmother also believed that you needed to learn progressively difficult hymns. So the first hymn that you learned was What a Friend We Have in Jesus. But the little organ that I had at home didn't have enough keys to play the bass line for What a Friend We Have in Jesus. So I said to my father and mother, I need a piano. I was not quite 4, I think I said, I need a piano. So my parents, who bargained with me, said, okay, here's the deal. When you learn to play What a Friend We Have in Jesus perfectly, we will buy you a piano. So the next day, I went to my grandmother's house, and I sat at that piano for 8 hours, and I practiced, and I practiced. My grandmother said I wouldn't even get up to have lunch. And when my parents came home, I knew how to play What a Friend We Have in Jesus perfectly. My poor parents, who did not have the money to buy a piano, went down to what was called Forbes Music Company in Birmingham and did one of those rent-to-own things. And so suddenly, at the end of the week, I had a brand new Wurlitzer piano.
There you go. Okay, one of the true confessions that I found in your book was that you admitted to, for a lifelong interest in procrastination.
Oh, yes.
That you're like any good college student, and maybe even later in your career, how you just put everything off until the last minute. So what I'd like to know, is there any incident in your life where it actually caught up with you?
Yes, in fact, I still have a tendency toward procrastination, unfortunately, but there are a couple of things that you can't procrastinate. I was very good at writing the English paper at the last minute and getting an A. I was very good at studying for the economics test, cramming for the economics test, and getting an A. But the one thing that you can't do is cram when you're learning something that's partly physical. So playing the piano, you will not get as good playing the piano if you play 8 hours in one day as if you play 1 hour for each of 8 days. It's a physical process. But of course, I crammed for my big piano competition, and I got to the piano competition. I was playing the Mozart D major piano sonata. And Mozart sonatas, you start the piece with something called the exposition. You state the case, state the melody. Then you develop it, and then you come back and you recapitulate the melody, and that's called sonata form. Well, I played the exposition, stated it, and ended the piece before I had played the middle. Because somehow in my procrastination I hadn't learned it well enough. And I was devastated. Now, it is true that the judges said that what I had played was good. Of course, I'd only played about a third of the piece. But that taught me an important lesson, never to procrastinate when it came to music.
Very neat. I think we all inherit traits, one trait or another, from our parents. I wonder, having read a great deal about your mother and father, if there are certain traits about them that you feel translated themselves into your role as National Security Advisor, or particularly Secretary of State. Yes. You know, your parents went through some very tough challenges and they faced difficult times. I wonder, did you see your father, your mother, speaking or working through you in some way in those very senior positions?
Yes. I always said that being brought up in Birmingham, and as I said, learning that circumstances shouldn't control you, circumstances shouldn't crush you, it was very important, both because those are hard jobs, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and you have to learn to get up and keep going. But it also convinced me that people can overcome old wounds and old difficulties. It convinced me that when you're working with young democracies and believing in freedom, that we have no right to be particularly impatient with those people, because we've been through so much. And I think my parents taught me perseverance. They taught me not to let things get you down. They taught me to try and be cool under pressure, that if you're running around with your hair on fire and everything's a problem, you're not going to get anything done. And I'm very grateful to them for that. I think my mother also taught me that one can be feminine, one can be completely at home in one's skin as a woman, and one can still have strong views and have a career and be very happy in life. And I'm very grateful to her for that. But so many times when I was flying into a war zone in Baghdad or Kabul, I could almost hear my parents say what they were fond of saying, which is, you're well prepared, and you're God's child. He'll take care of you. And that's the strongest foundation that anyone can give you.
That's great. There is a sad but also wonderful story in your book about how your father came to become a Republican.
Yes.
And I wonder if you would relate that story for us.
Well, my parents went down to register to vote in Birmingham in 1952. They were courting. They weren't yet married. And my mother, who was beautiful, fair-skinned and long hair, quite beautiful. And so the poll tester, because there were poll tests for blacks, you had to pass a test in order to register to vote. He said to her, so what do you do? She said, I teach school. He said, so you probably know who the first president of the United States was. And she said, yes, George Washington. He said, fine, you can register. Then he looked at my rather intimidating dark-skinned father and he said, how many beans are in that jar? And there were hundreds of beans. And of course, my father couldn't count them. And so my father was very devastated by this. And he went back and he was talking to an old man in his church, Mr. Frank Hunter. And Mr. Hunter said, oh, Reverend, he said, I'll show you how to get registered. He said, we'll go down there. And there's this clerk. And she's a Republican. And she's trying to build the Republican Party. She'll register anybody who'll say they're a Republican. And so you know, despite the fact that you didn't actually register by party, I suspect that what this woman did was that in exchange for registering, maybe you joined the Republican Party, and my father did. And he was a lifelong Republican his entire life. So.
Okay, now, as we've said before, you started off as a Democrat, became a Republican, converted during the
It's fine, converted.
during the Reagan administration. What was at the root of your belief that it was time to make a change and that the Republican Party was more comfortable for you?
Well, in August of 1979, I went to study language in the Soviet Union. I was a Russianist, and after a couple of months, I came back. And in December of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Now, I had just been in the Soviet Union, and I had seen it for, I think, everything that it was. And President Carter said, you know, I learned more about the Soviet Union today than I've known in all my life. And then he boycotted the Olympics. And I thought, is this the best that the United States of America can do in confronting the Soviet Union, this big, aggressive, terrible, amoral power? And not too long after that, President Reagan, then Governor Reagan, Ronald Reagan, was running for office, and he was talking about the Soviet Union and how he saw communism. And I thought, yeah, that is the leadership that the United States needs to confront this behemoth that is the Soviet Union. And I voted for Ronald Reagan. I then changed my party registration, I think a couple years later. I didn't think much about it. And then it was national security that brought me to the party. But of course, now, as I've said many times, I'm a proud Republican. I don't agree with everything that everybody in the party says who does. But I'm a firm believer in the power of the individual rather than the constraints of the group. I'm a firm believer in the American ideal and American values. I'm a firm believer in free markets, and that free markets and free people go hand in hand. And so I'm a dedicated Republican.
I certainly don't want to give the book away for those that haven't read it yet, but there is a really interesting passage that I see is making some news since your book was published towards the end that was all about the fact that you almost had to turn down working for President Bush. And I know it was a remarkably difficult time in your life and a difficult decision, but could you tell the audience about that?
Well, I think you know how much my parents meant to me by the way I've talked about them. And I lost my mother in 1985. She finally succumbed to breast cancer 15 years after it had first struck her in 1970. I was very grateful that I was 30, not 15. And so, but I lost my mother in 1985. My father then moved out to California because we didn't have any family in Denver, and I wanted him to be near me, and fortunately he wanted to be there. And so he remarried several years later, about 3 years later, and I was delighted. And my stepmother is a wonderful woman. But he was doing relatively well, but my dad had a heart attack when he was 61. He had diabetes, he had high blood pressure, he had an athlete's body that had gone bad because of bad knees and lack of exercise, so he had a lot of health problems that whole time. But then in 2000, February of 2000, as I was ramping up with the campaign of George W. Bush, he had what doctors call an anoxic brain incident. In other words, his heart stopped and he had damage to his brain. And he recovered some, but he was from that day on wasn't at all mobile. And I knew that he understood that I had been asked to be National Security Advisor. In fact, I'll never forget that tears rolled down his eyes. And I thought to myself, I don't know if he is expressing joy that I am going to do this or despair that we're going to be separated. And I just couldn't bring myself to leave him. And so when Governor Bush offered me the national security job, I said, sure. And the next morning I called him and I said, I can't go. I can't leave my father in this condition. And he said, I'm not asking you to leave your daddy. I know how important that is to you. And of course, he himself, a great son of a great father. He said, so we'll do something. You'll come back every week or every other week to California. And I think we both knew it wasn't practical. But that was the only way that I was going to try to do it. Ironically then, and this is where the book ends, on December 24th, after Florida had been resolved, my father watched as Florida was resolved. On December 24th, my father died. And I say in the book something that I almost didn't write. The only words I almost didn't write in the book is I was never quite certain and would like to think that it isn't just one final thing that he did to make it possible for me to go on. But frankly, it would have been just like him.
I have about 150 more questions, none of which I will ask because I'd like to give you all the chance, so please be thinking of one as I ask my last question, which is, of course, the most important. Will we see Stanford in the Rose Bowl this year?
Well, now, I never, ever jinx my teams. But I have to say, I'm loving watching the Cardinal play this year. And it's fun because they're very tough. They play the kind of football that I like, which is kind of smash mouth, you know, let's run it at you. And I don't know, I know I'm in Southern California, so I'll say this gingerly, but I don't know if you all saw the hit that our quarterback put on the USC player who had recovered the fumble. This is a great group of kids, and they're really fun to watch. And I don't know about the Rose Bowl, but I'm keeping my post-Christmas time free this time.
Very good, then. We'd like to take some questions from the audience. If you've got one, we have staff that are roaming each of the aisles that will have a microphone. The only request I make is that if you have one, if you could wait till they put the microphone in your hand so that we can hear the question. And we'll start right over here.
Hi, my name is Christina, and I had read General Tommy Frank's book, and when he had got a call from Dick Cheney when he was in Afghanistan about maybe invading Iraq, I was just wondering if you were consulted and how that all came down at that time, because it seemed like the way General Tommy Franks talked about it, it was like, oh, by the way, what do you think about invading Iraq? That's the way he sort of talks about it, and it's sort of and I was just wondering how you were involved in some of those decisions.
Sure. No, it was a very deliberate process in terms of whether or not it was time to remove Saddam Hussein and whether that needed to come by military force. Starting all the way back in the spring of 2003, when we were getting consistent reports that Saddam Hussein continued to talk about Kuwait as a province of Iraq. Now what we know to be erroneous intelligence that he had rebuilt his biological capability and his chemical capability and could be as little as a year from having a crude nuclear weapon. And we went through a very deliberate process of assessing the threat, a very deliberate process of looking at the potential for military force, a very deliberate process at looking at what we would try to do in the aftermath, and then a very deliberate process of trying to get Saddam Hussein to leave peacefully, either to allow inspectors in to really get a handle on what his weapons of mass destruction capabilities were. He said there was at one point, the Egyptians said he wanted $1 billion. We said, done, if you'll leave. And so it was a very deliberate process, and I, as National Security Advisor, helped to organize that process.
Yes, right over here.
Thank you. To what do you ascribe President Bush's rather sunny assessment of Vladimir Putin, and did you agree with that assessment?
Well, I have thought a lot about that moment, and let me be very clear. When we first met Vladimir Putin in 2001 in Slovenia, He was almost a little bit shy. He was not the Putin that we've come to know, you know, bare-chested and hunting tigers. That's an artifact of much later and the high price of oil, I think. But at the time, we also expected great cooperation. Now, imagine yourself, you are meeting the president of Russia for the first time. You're the president of the United States. And still to this, it's not so much now, but in 2001, before 9/11, that moment when the president of Russia and the president of the United States met was still the biggest thing on the world stage, just like it had been before with the great summits. And so you're at the press conference, you've had a pretty good conversation with Putin, who has said he would cooperate on a whole variety of things. Russia has not yet made the hard turn toward authoritarianism that it would a couple of years later. And you're asked, do you trust Vladimir Putin? Now, if you say no, this relationship's off to a really bad start. And if you say yes, then people say, well, you know, should you trust this guy? And somehow President Bush said, you know, he had, by the way, been in this conversation with him about the cross that he was wearing and so forth, and he said something about his soul. And I do remember at the moment thinking, that's going to be misinterpreted. I think he was simply trying to give an answer that says, you know, this man and I are just starting our relationship, and I'm basically going to trust him until I have some reason not to. And to be quite fair, the first year or so after 9/11, the Russians were terrific. They were one of our best allies in the war on terror. Unfortunately, by 2003, 2004, they were turning authoritarian inside, and they were starting to resent the fact that the United States had good relations with the countries on the periphery of what had been the Soviet Union and the former countries of the Warsaw Pact. But I think that's what happened in that one incident.
Yes, right here.
Would you consider, if in the right circumstances, would you come back into public office?
Thank you. Well, I can't imagine those circumstances. And I'll tell you, look, it's not just because I've got accustomed to reading the newspaper and thinking, oh, isn't that interesting? And realizing I don't have to do anything about what's there. So that's one of the reasons. But it's also that I was fortunate enough to be Secretary of State of this great country. And when you're the chief diplomat, you get to see your country through a whole different set of lenses. And George Shultz, who is one of my great mentors and was, of course, President Reagan's Secretary of State, told me, he said, you know, Secretary of State is the best job in government. And he was right. You get to represent the United States. You get to try to mobilize the power, both power in terms of assets and power in terms of values and beliefs of this country on behalf of what's good in the world. And it's hard for me to imagine wanting to do something after that. I do public service. I'm very involved in K-12 education issues. I'm involved with the Boys and Girls Clubs. I've written in the book that because of my own upbringing and the very central role that education played, and my father and grandfather and parents as kind of educational evangelists, the issue that these days occupies me most is that I can look at your zip code and I can know whether or not you're going to get a good education, and that's really, really a crime. And so I think I'll probably do public service in those ways instead.
Yes, over here.
I actually have two questions. One is, why did Stanford have to humiliate UCLA when you guys came out? My question is, the blending of the old war, the Cold War, with the new war, the war on terror, it seems that Russia is becoming more and more of a pest to the United States. You know, they're going into Venezuela now with Iran and the sanctions. How, if you were Secretary of State, what would you advise us to do at this point?
You know, the Russian relationship is complicated, and it's made more complicated by all that they're going through internally. We, in the early 90s, we all thought, this is great, the Soviet Union's collapsed, Russia's on its way to democracy, we all loved Boris Yeltsin, he was kind of a big bear of a guy, and we saw the flowering of democracy and capitalism in Russia. But the Russian people, actually, I went there a lot in the 90s, saw it as a period of humiliation, deprivation, and chaos. You could walk down Tverskaya, the main street of Moscow, and see men with machine guns protecting these oligarchs. You could walk along the old Arabada kind of market street and see old ladies trying to sell a teacup because their pension had collapsed. And so Vladimir Putin comes to power. He says, I'll give you respect, I'll give you prosperity, and I'll give you order. And now, instead of just stopping at that, there really was chaos in the 90s, but instead of stopping at that point that we kind of call the controlled chaos that we call democracy, it swung through to authoritarianism. That then has complicated their foreign policy because the other half of that walnut, internal authoritarianism, tends to be a sense of empire in the foreign policy side. Now, to be fair to the Russians, on most global issues, they were cooperative right up until the end for us, whether it was the Middle East or even Iran, where they signed on to sanctions. China was much more a problem on sanctions than the Russians by the end. The Russians were very helpful on North Korea. Yes, they did some annoying things, and I remember exactly the incident you're talking about. They flew two bear bombers down the coast of Venezuela, down the coast of the Western Hemisphere, to demonstrate their support for Hugo Chavez. And sometimes in foreign policy, you're better off to call a spade a spade. So I called up Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and I said, Sergei, do you really believe that anybody thinks that you're flying two anachronistic bear bombers that are older than I am down the coast of Venezuela somehow changes the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere? What are you doing? I said, and oh, by the way, I've talked to the Defense Department, and we are prepared to stand by and do search and rescue because they're so old they're going to drop out of the sky. And so, to a certain extent, when they did annoying things, you just had to call them annoying things. But I do think that where we got into trouble with Russia, and people continue to, is when you're talking about the periphery. When you're talking about countries that are now independent that used to be part of the Soviet Union, Georgia, the Central Asian countries, particularly Ukraine, which is like the right arm of Slavdom. That's where Slavdom was founded. And there, I think you have to stand up for the proposition that these are independent states, independent countries that have the right to have the friends and allies that they wish to have. And don't back off on countries that are part of NATO, that used to be a part of the Warsaw Pact. Allowing the Russians to somehow recreate the politics of the Cold War doesn't make any sense. They lost the Cold War. I think they understand that. And so people have to deal with that reality. But on most issues, and by the way, especially in the war on terror, they were pretty good allies.
I think we have one up here.
I just wanted to say on behalf of global women, thank you so much for the example that you set for all of us. Not in America, as you can probably hear, but I just remember those years when you were up there on the global stage. It was such an inspiration.
Thank you.
You just signed for me a book for my 14-year-old daughter, taking it back to the memoir of your family. She said to me after you signed the book, I called her and told her, and she said, well, what would she say to me, Mummy, and is she nice?
Oh.
What do you say to the 14-year-olds growing up today who now believe, because of women like you who stood up and who have stood up for who you are and for what's right, that we can completely influence the world? What would you say to Danielle?
Well, thank you. Well, I would say to Danielle and her friends, first of all, over the next several years, find what it is that you love to do. Find what it is that you're passionate about. And if you are fortunate, you'll be passionate about something that you're also good at doing. And I would say to Danielle that she may find that if she doesn't find her passion, that it will find her, like my passion found me. I started out life to be a concert pianist. I had played piano from age 3. I was going to be a concert pianist. And then I went off to college, majored in music. And at the end of my sophomore year, I went to the Aspen Music Festival School, where they have a lot of prodigies. And I met 12-year-olds who could play from sight what it had taken me all year to learn. I thought, I'm about to end up teaching 13-year-olds to murder Beethoven or maybe playing at Nordstrom, but I'm not going to play Carnegie Hall. And so now I'm saying to Danielle's mother, I went home and I had that conversation with my parents. Mom and Dad, I'm changing my major. What are you changing your major to, dear? I don't know. You don't know what you want to do with your life. That's right, it's my life. That's right, it's our money. Find a major. And fortunately for me, I wandered into a course in international politics taught by a Soviet specialist named Joseph Korbel, who was Madeleine Albright's father, by the way. And Joseph Korbel opened up this world to me of Russia and international things and diplomacy. And so I would say to Danielle, there was no earthly reason that a black girl from Birmingham, Alabama should have become a Soviet specialist. But I loved doing it. And one day in May of 1990, when President George H.W. Bush had asked me to bring Gorbachev back to California during his summit here, I was sitting on the White House lawn in a helicopter, taking off with Gorbachev and Raisa Gorbacheva, and I said, you know, to myself, I'm really glad I changed my major. This was a good thing. And so I would say to Danielle, do not let anybody define what you're going to be and what's going to interest you. Even if it looks like something that you shouldn't be interested in because you are fill in the blank, black, female, Hispanic, don't go there. Do what interests you, do what you're passionate about. Work very, very hard at it. Work hard at things that are not easy for you, because it is all too easy for students in college to high school and college to just do the things that they're good at. So if she's good at math, tell her to write a lot. If she's good at writing, tell her to do a lot of math. And finally, don't try to plan every step from now until she's 35 or 40. Just plan the next few steps, because when my students come to me and say, how do I get to do what you do? And they really mean, how do I get to be Secretary of State? I say, you start out as a failed piano major and you go from there.
We have time for a few more questions. We'll go over here.
Madam Secretary, if you could bring to mind your father's favorite sermon, where would it go and what direction would he preach?
Yes. My dad was a theologian. He had been to divinity school, but he was one of those theologians who liked to stir the pot. And so his favorite sermons, and those I do have the outlines for. My father, like his father, never wrote out a text. He was a great extemporaneous speaker. But his favorite sermons were about the time during the run up to Christ's crucifixion and the immediate time after, during the period just before the resurrection and even after the resurrection, when the disciples, these very human men who had given up everything and followed Christ in his ministry for the 3+ years, suddenly realized that he could be killed like a common criminal. And when they didn't quite understand what was going on, and they were scared and they were disbelieving and they were terrified of what lay ahead, he always said, there's that one part of Scripture, in my Father's house are many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you. And he said, I can imagine him saying to them, you know where I'm going. And they're saying, no, the problem is we don't know where you're going. And he used those moments with the disciples, the men who had walked closest to Christ, as an illustration that it's all right to have questions. And it's all right to have doubts. And you will not be condemned for struggling with your faith. And those were his best sermons, I think. And I think because he, with me, allowed me also not to allow my intellect and faith to become enemies of one another, but rather to use them together to struggle with faith. I never went through one of those crises of faith that people of the mind often go through. I always knew that it was all right to struggle. But probably his most controversial sermon was one in which he took a rather sympathetic view of Judas and what it must have been like to be Judas, not knowing quite what your chosen role was in the great unfolding of this story.
Yes. What do you feel was your greatest accomplishment as National Security Advisor and also as Secretary of State?
Yes. Well, I'm a great believer that history has a long arc, and things that look great right now may look not very good in retrospect and vice versa. And so I think that we will not know for some time, given the big historical events that we were dealing with, what really turned out to be the greatest accomplishments. But I will tell you that I hope that when our administration is remembered, we will be remembered for having stood for the proposition that no man, woman, or child should have to live in tyranny. That the United States of America was willing to stand for the proposition that every human being wants and deserves the benefits and the pleasures of freedom. America has been at its best when it leads from power and principle. I mean, one of the great things about President Reagan was that he was not afraid to exercise American power, but he did it on behalf of American principles. And it was because he stood so strong for those principles that things that we never dreamed might happen actually did. You know, I know that there are people who thought that President Bush, George W. Bush, and I was said to be, we were idealist. We were idealistic, people said. We weren't realist. Well, you know, an idealist is just an optimist who believes that what ought to be might actually come to pass and isn't prepared to accept the world as it is, but recognizes that you can work for the world to be as it ought to be. And in that sense, I think that President Reagan was very much the same way. So the United States, it's true, had struggled for 40 years with communism. A lot of really good decisions were taken in 47 and 48 and 49 by people like Harry Truman. But I'm quite convinced that had we not led from principle, the Soviet Union would not have collapsed, communism would not have ended. And if we continue to lead from principle and the belief that men, women, and children deserve not to live in tyranny, we're going to defeat this latest threat, too, of terrorism and Islamic extremism, because ultimately what defeats ideologies of hatred and ideologies of oppression is to confront them with the realities of freedom.
We have time for one last question right over here.
Secretary,
yes.
First off, on behalf of my family and the millions of families, your steadfastness and loyalty to the administration is almost like the saying is family is the most important thing. So thank you for keeping us safe. And, two quick questions. I wonder where that rumor always came about back to football. The commissioner aspirations. And second, what's your view with, with the Soviet Union, their ties with Cuba and how it went down. Now we have the new regime change in North Korea and the ties to China. What's your perception on that the first time I hear the football question?
Well, let me reverse them. Let me start with North Korea and China. North Korea deserves the title hermit kingdom. This is the most isolated place in the world. I remember we were having a National Security Council meeting once and somebody said, we have to get the North Koreans to tell the truth. And I thought, these are people who tell their people North Korea is paradise and South Korea is a prison camp. They're not acquainted with the truth. And this was really a problem. Now, the Chinese were actually very helpful through the six-party talks in trying to help us deal with the North Korean nuclear threat. And I think they need to be given a lot of credit for the way that we work together on that. When it comes to the regime, though, and what might happen there, China worries about stability above all else in that region. And they worry about a flood of North Korean refugees, and they worry about a collapse of the regime. We always tried to get them to see that, in fact, that regime is eventually going to collapse one way or another, and it would be better to start opening it up and starting to create conditions in which perhaps there's a peaceful collapse of it, because it's going to collapse. But that's the problem for the Chinese. But I think through the six-party talks, the framework, it's still possible to manage the North Korean problem with China, Japan, South Korea, the United States, and Russia together at the table. And that machinery is still there. Now as to the commissioner's job in football. I think I mentioned in my opening remarks, my parents had a bet. The boy was going to be named John. He was going to have a football. He was going to be an All-American linebacker. My mother got to name the girl, Condoleezza, after an Italian musical term meaning with sweetness. So that was but I was an only child. So it was music with my mom, and it was sports with my father, particularly football. And our team was the Cleveland Browns, because they were the team we got on TV every Sunday with Jim Brown and Paul Brown, and we didn't have any teams in Birmingham, Alabama. And I'm still a Cleveland Browns fan. You might notice they've only lost 5 games. They've played 6, but that's all right. Things are going to get better. And so I was a huge football fan, and my dad and I would watch football. We'd go down to the drugstore just before the season. We'd buy Street and Smith's Pro Football Report, and we'd go over it in great detail. So I was born to this. So people would ask me, well, what's your dream job? You've been National Security Advisor, Secretary of State. What's your dream job? I'd say NFL Commissioner. And I was only half joking. However, shortly after we left, Roger Goodell nicely invited me to address the owners at their annual meeting. And he introduced me as the woman who might have had his job, but I was Secretary of State when it came up, and I wasn't available. And I said to him what is absolutely true. I said, Roger, when I was struggling with the Iranians and the Russians every day, your job looked pretty good. But from Northern California and Stanford, your job doesn't look so good anymore. And so I think I will leave it to our very fine commissioner of the NFL, Roger Goodell, and I'll be a fan.
Well, you've just been so terrific, Madam Secretary, and we're so delighted to have you here. All of us just want to thank you, and one round of applause for a wonderful Secretary of State. Just terrific, just terrific. Yeah, I'm going to ask everyone to remain in their seats.
All right.
If you could kindly do us one favor, if everyone could just remain in your place until Mrs. Reagan has escorted out of the hall, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming.